Salutations, ladies and gentlemen, the Knife Raven here, back again with another video. And in today's video, it's been a while, and I'm returning to you with a video that I have both anticipated and also dreaded. The reason why is because, on one hand, this is a video on what are perhaps my very favorite knives, the Ettricks. But at the same time, it's, unlike usual, viewing them in a very negative light. Now, this may seem surprising, if not concerning, to some of my long-term reviewers, but bear with me. This is going to be interesting, to say the least. Now, before I begin the actual topic of this video, I would just like to say that this is a personal experience and does not mean that everyone who gets one of these is going to experience something similar. But it is perhaps a warning. Now, what are we discussing today with these knives? Well, to begin, this is what you may recognize as my very first Ettrick knife. This is an ebony. Still a very well put together knife, and one that I am quite happy with. And over the years, I acquired a few more of these, gaining an overall collection of about 8 Ettricks from 2 brands, those mainly being Arthur Wright, with the exception of 2 Michael May. Now, what has happened here is something very shocking to me, and it will begin with a brief story. So I'll take that out of the way and bring forth the main character in this little tale of mine. That being this knife. Now this, some of you may recognize as my most recent Ettrick acquisition, and perhaps my favorite. This is a Michael May Ettrick in bog oak handles with a filed spine. Now, what is so, interesting about this to bring it out a second time? Well, first and foremost, in normal conditions, I'd say I don't need an excuse to bring this knife out, as I like it so much. However, today, unfortunately, this knife is going to be going through a bit of a different viewpoint, if you will. Now, this knife originally came with a fairly rounded tip. It wasn't blunt by any means, but compared to what I believe an Ettrick should look like, this being perhaps the star example from Arthur Wright, you can see it has a very acute, very, very fine tip at the end of this Wharncliffe blade. Now, this is what I typically imagine when I think of a proper Ettrick Wharncliffe. And this Michael May, when new, was a little bit too stubby for my liking. So I decided to, because it could use it anyway, give it a bit of a sharpening and see if I could perhaps increase the potency of the tip. Now, I've never had to worry about this before, but when I typically sharpen a knife, I'm not exactly worried about anything catastrophic occurring from doing so. I've acknowledged before that I'm not the best sharpener in the world, but at the same time, I never expect to irreversibly damage anything. But what happened when I tried to sharpen this was that by wearing away some of the edge and bringing it up, as naturally you do when sharpening a knife, so of course the cutting edge is worn away and brought up a little bit, so you have a fresh new edge a little bit higher up. Naturally, that raises the profile of the tip, which is exactly what happened, giving me an example of a sudden proud tip, which is where the tip of the blade sits high above the liners, thus making the knife unsafe. And I attempted to fix my mistake, to no avail. I had heard that you can drop the kick, which is of course the unsharpened part of the blade, and then that will allow the blade to sit deeper into the frame and thus remedy the problem. But I wasn't going to risk it at that point, so I took it in to a professional sharpener who I trusted to do with this knife what I could not. And while you can see the tip is now well in the liner, which is quite nice considering it was sitting about this high above before, in the process, the blade unfortunately had to be somewhat reprofiled. And you can see what we have here is not technically a true Wharncliffe anymore, as the edge is not perfectly straight. This has also shortened the knife quite considerably. Now, this was what I was hoping. A single example of a knife that unfortunately now looks quite used, even though it really was only ever sharpened once. So that was quite the tragedy, but it doesn't end there. You see, I typically do sharpening in batches. I don't just take a knife out and sharpen it and put it away. Typically, if I find a variety of knives that seem a little bit blunter than they should be, I will take them all out and sharpen them in a batch. So I was tending to my batch of Ettrick knives. Again, out of all the knives that I carry, and again, you can make your remarks that are most likely true about a collector rarely ever using their knives, and that is true. But if ever there was a knife I was going to use more than any other, it's most likely going to be an Etric. So I was taking my batch of Ettricks and giving them a sharpen. And I found that every single one, after this singular attempt of sharpening, and again, some of them, particularly this ebony one, which has been around for a very decent amount of time, as opposed to, say, the spog oak model, which is more recent, these knives hadn't been sharpened in a while, so it took a little bit longer than I would have liked. But while I would have been satisfied with the job done, I realized that every single one, with the exception of this example, which I left alone, had acquired a proud tip as well. Naturally, I was horrified, and I figured I'm not going to mess with these, I'm not going to file down the kick, and in the case of this rosewood model, the tip was so incredibly proud, even filing down the kick I don't think would have worked. So again, I brought these knives back to the same fellow who remedied this model, and I should say they did a very nice job. The knives are very sharp now, and thankfully aren't a hazard to pull out of your pocket. But unfortunately, this left almost all of my Ettricks misshapen. And I think I might have, well, invented a bit of a new pattern here. The Ettrick sheepfoot. Now, this is what an Ettrick is supposed to look like. The reason this one looks so pristine is that I haven't needed to sharpen it yet. You can see it's considerably longer, pointier, and has a more gentle, gradual curve. Now, what has happened with these models is almost universal. That, of course, is the ebony model, the buffalo, one of the two bog oak models, and, of course, the rosewood, which is perhaps the most noticeable. Now, right there, that's 5 of my 8 Ettricks, which have been permanently reprofiled and don't even really resemble their original pattern. Here are the knives, of course, that were left alone. This one, which I was smart enough not to sharpen, and thus ruin. This one, which hasn't been sharpened at all. And finally, an Ettrick pruner, which has a completely different style of blade. Now, aside from these 3, my entire collection, the majority of my collection, has been permanently altered. Now, I can already tell there are a few questions, and I will answer a few of them before you have to comment them. One is, why after the first proud tip did I not just stop sharpening them? The answer to that is partially my perfectionism. I feel that it is my duty to fix a problem that I've created and to remedy things when I see I can, even if I can't. And the second reason is because I was being an idiot. And I'm not proud to admit that, but it is true. I figured that perhaps each model would be different and it would not happen the same way. But the point I'm getting at is, my idiocy aside, this shouldn't have happened, as I have sharpened knives before that have remained perfectly fine and do not have any issue with a proud tip. This wasn't my fault. This was a fault in the design. Now, one thing that struck me as quite interesting, and before I continue, I will mention this. This olive wood model here, which has swift become my favorite of my Ettricks, partially, of course, due to its handle, but also because of this. I'm unsure as to why, but this model sits particularly deep in the frame. And if you're wondering, here it is next to a bog oak model. And you can see that it's, well, like night and day. One model is quite deep in the handle, whereas the other is a hair away from being proud itself. This is what the majority of them looked like. This is a novelty. Now, part of me is hoping, and it's probably falsely placed hope, that this is some sort of design change that Arthur Wright has gone with to prevent some form of flaw like this. And I truly believe that even an inexperienced sharpener could wear away a bit of that blade, and it would still take a long time before the tip sat proud. So, by all means, this is still a perfectly functional knife, and one that I still have no problems with. But even this example, this bog oak one, you can see that's very, very close to being proud. Dangerously, in fact. I'd say one sharpening, and that will be proud as well. Again, we have another bog oak model here to compare. And this one had to be reprofiled. So, you can see that depending on the knife, there does seem to be a bit of a difference here. Some pieces suffer from this, and some don't. I'm unsure as to why this is, and I'm even more curious to know what the reasoning behind such a change is. But by all means, if whatever this knife has done right, I highly, highly suggest that brands take note and try to replicate this in whatever way they can, as this is more than acceptable, but these just aren't. So anyways, back to my failed experiment of remedying this. So again, I attempted to fix these and quite miserably failed, only making the problem worse, and eventually I gave up, realizing that at this point, a professional was the only one who could save these knives. And while they are back in using order, perfectly sharp, the blades are functional, they have lost their base profile, which is an absolute shame. Now, what does this mean for my Etric collecting? Well, to put it simply, I don't think I'll be collecting these knives anymore. At least not until I can come to an actual reason and a root cause for why this seems to be so present, or until I find that the makers shift to producing the knives like this with a very significantly recessed tip, in which case then I think that the problem would disappear quite quickly. As naturally, a knife, once you use it for a very long time, the more you sharpen it, the closer to being proud the knife will be. However, there are some knives that can get around this. This is a knife, the Tonneau by Thierry Zard, and this is a piece I discussed a couple years ago, and it's a very, very interesting piece. It's got a ram foot profile blade, very heavy on the file work, and it comes with a corkscrew. This is a traditional French knife that it was often used for agricultural purposes, and was also a frequent gift given to employers, or given from employers to their employees. Now, why am I saying this? Well, this knife, when I first did my review on it, I had a complaint. It suffered from blade wrap. At the very tip, the blade would accumulate a little bit of chipping, because when you close the knife, the tip rests on part of the back spring. And I thought this was terrible. Well, obviously, if you close the knife, that's going to be causing an impact, and thus you're going to be damaging the edge. Why ever would someone do this? Well, lately, partially as an escape from this form of problem that I have found to be so present in Sheffield knives, particularly the Ettricks, I have been researching French knives and have found them to be quite capable of remedying this proud tip issue by simply having the tip of the blade rest on the spring. Because when you sharpen the knife and you raise the edge, while yes, normally this would end up happening, as typically with a knife that has a kick that stops the blade from going any deeper into the handle, with a knife that rests on the spring, or rather a tip that rests on the spring, every time the tip wears away, the blade drops, remedying the problem itself. Now, first and foremost, I would like to apologize for complaining so much about blade wrap on traditional French knives, which I saw to be such a problem. But now, I really do see the purpose of it. For example, here's another Sheffield knife from Arthur Wright Sons, the stag spear point I discussed not that long ago. You can see that the tip is very, very close to being proud. It isn't proud, but again, after one or two sharpenings, no doubt, that's going to be a problem. Now, this brings up quite a few worthy talking points, and I'm not going to make this an hour-long video, although I'm sure I could. I'm very good at rambling. But what I wanted to do with this video, aside from explaining why, if I ever use an Etric in any future comparisons, why they look so incredibly mangled, and also really to bring to light a problem that has really taken away a lot of the joy of collecting this knife pattern for me. And I understand this seems unnecessary, and it is just a knife, but I've realized that we in the knife community see knives as a very sentimental, important object. They have value to us individually for different reasons, and some people may despise what others love. So, even if it seems to be a bit immature, I do find that a flaw like this has severely damaged my outlook on this knife pattern, and it's quite the shame, as when you buy a knife, you should expect to be able to use it for a decent amount of time without having to worry about any long-term problems arising. That's why we're so picky about fit and finish. We want to know that there's a good quality, solid knife that will remain whole and perform in the way it's supposed to for as many years as possible. After all, a good traditional knife could usually last a person a lifetime. So, that's mainly what I wanted to say here. I don't think until this flaw can be brought to light, or perhaps explained or solved more easily, I will not be purchasing any more Ettrick knives. And I don't usually do this, as I see it as the buyer's choice for what they do and don't buy, but I would almost say I wouldn't recommend these anymore. And that goes across brands. Again, there's Michael May and then there's Arthur Wright. Of course, the most examples I have are from Arthur Wright, but that doesn't change the fact that the one Wharncliffe Michael May that I have suffers from this very problem. And don't be under the assumption that this is strictly tied to Ettrick knives. Again, this spear point is very close to having a proud tip as well. An Ottermesser spear point that I reviewed about a year ago in Wengewood is the exact same thing. The tip is a hair away from being proud. And again, this may sound like trying to spread paranoia amongst the knife community, but perhaps it's worth taking a look at your knives and seeing how they fare in this department. As I understand, those will say, well, you can just file down the kick, you can solve the problem yourself. But I suppose what I'm getting at is you shouldn't need to. A maker should have a knife produced, and when they let that knife leave the factory, usually the intention is to have a knife given to someone that could last them a lifetime. And it shouldn't require that they essentially customize the knife to work around a flaw that the maker shouldn't have allowed in the first place. And I know, I'm no knife maker, I'm no company executive, I don't know the ins and outs, but I do know what I can see. And frankly, when I see a knife that can be made like this, or alternatively, like this, with something built in to prevent such an issue, when I see things like this, I question why that happens. And so, again, this is by no means an attack upon Arthur Wright, Michael May, any of the makers who've ever produced knives that could suffer from proud tips, but it certainly is a reminder to knife collectors to constantly reevaluate what they find in their knives and test them to see if they will truly hold up in the ways that they're supposed to. But also to anyone who happens to be marketing particularly traditional knives, but knives in general, it is a good idea that perhaps you should be a bit more mindful to look into things like this and ask that, well, if I send out a knife where the tip isn't proud, but is just a hair away from being proud, that means that the customer will have to remedy that the next time they sharpen this knife. And that, frankly, is not a good way to go about business. Producing something passable that leaves the factory in condition that would not be considered flawed, but you know is going to, well, be improperly functioning later on, and that the customer has to remedy that themselves. So, again, this has been a rant, and it's gone for 22 minutes now. So, yes, this is a tale of many things. Again, my curiosity, which led to perfectionism and stubbornness, refusing to deal with this in perhaps a more professional way, but it has been a learning experience for me. And also, I am happy that this happened to me in such a way. As if this happened with just one knife, I could pass it off as my own poor sharpening attempt. But it happened on so many of these, and it hasn't happened on other knives that I've sharpened before. I think that I can safely say this isn't a problem with the sharpener, and I'm sure it very well could be in certain instances, but this shouldn't happen. You shouldn't need to reprofile a blade like this. It's absurd, and again, I'm still going to keep these knives. I still enjoy them for what they are. But this has very much impacted my view on Ettricks and traditional knives as a whole. I think I will forever be paranoid now and constantly looking for proud tips or near to proud tips. But I suppose the positive of this is it has pushed me in the direction of more traditional French knives, as now I am very curious to look into more of these, as I very much appreciate, although a bit strange, their method of dealing with proud tips. So, no, don't want to do that. But anyways, if you have made it to the end of this video, thank you very much. This has been a pain for me to film. I've attempted this video about 4 times now, and if you're seeing this, I suppose this was the successful attempt. But this, again, was something I didn't want to discuss, but at the same time I felt it necessary. I'm typically a fairly positive reviewer. I always bring up the best in knives and want to be complimentary to them and their makers, and generally fairly forgiving about gapping and slightly offset grinds or raised covers, but there are certainly some issues that irritate me more than others, and this is definitely near the top of the list now. So, there you are. That is my ramble concluded. I hope you gained some enjoyment from that, or if not enjoyment, at very least, some things to think on and consider, and perhaps also, if enough people can confirm that similar things have happened to them, maybe we might just get the attention of the makers, and perhaps remedy this once and for all. I'm not terribly optimistic, as again, I am just some random individual who happens to talk a lot about knives and enjoy a lot of knives, but who knows? People have a voice in numbers, so if this is something that has bothered you personally, or if it's something that has come to light recently for you, or if it's something that would personally convince you not to buy any of these knives, well then, I suppose I have done something worthwhile. So, thank you very much for watching. This has been the tragedy of the Ettricks, I suppose. Perhaps that'll be the video title. And this is the Knife Raven, as always, signing off. Goodbye.